Kent Mayor Dana Ralph, and I am joined today by our Chief of Police, Ralph Padilla. We are back to talk a little bit more about some of the things that have come out of the legislature this last session regarding police reform. We have talked through tactics and some of those bills related to police tactics, and today we're going to cover use of force. What has changed? And Chief, I really want to start with, help me understand what use of force means. That's a technical term in the police world. I think it means different things to different people. So let's sort of ground ourselves in what that encompasses.
Right. And it's a great question, because I think a lot of people, when they hear use of force, they presume things like shooting and tasers and higher levels of force than what we would continue. And so it's important to note that in our policy, it defines use of force as any action taken by one of our officers to use physical restraint. So if I grab you to keep you from running, that's a use of force. If we're in a struggle and I push you down so I can maybe get to a position where I can handcuff you, that's use of force. Use of force is not defined only by the result of injury. It's any action that a police officer will do that may cause that injury. And so a lot of our use of force reports are on incidents where there are 0 injuries involved. So it's a wide spectrum. It's not just shooting, tasers, and strikes. I
think that definition is really important, because I will say, in my mind, it's definitely the more significant things that I consider use of force. But if you've got somebody and grab their arm, then that comes out as a use of force report.
Correct.
And when we look at the data, that's that whole broad spectrum.
Correct.
Okay. So we had some bills come out of the legislature this session regarding use of force. You want to talk through some of those things that happened, and then what that means to us in policing here? Right.
The laws have changed, but I want to remind our viewers, our community members, that Kent Police still historically only uses force in 0.003% of the times. So we're talking about a small number of incidents, but they're also extremely important, right? And extremely important to get it right. So that's where it comes in. So the bill we're talking about that will be in law July 25th is House Bill 1310. And this significantly changes the authority, if you will, of law enforcement to use force. And it raises the standard from reasonable suspicion, kind of what we talked about in the tactics bill, where an officer just has to have a reasonable hunch, if you will, that crime is occurring and this person's involved in that crime. It now elevates it to probable cause. And probable cause means that the officer now has articulable facts that a reasonable person or reasonable officer would believe gives them grounds to make an arrest. So more likely than not, this person committed the crime.
Okay.
So that's a much higher threshold, right? So that's the standard now. So officers are restricted from using force only when, if they have probable cause for an arrest. Okay, so, and we talked about that. And, or the law also authorizes use of force if there's an imminent threat to bodily injury. Okay. So if I see someone who's behaving in a dangerous way and I believe that they're about to let's say 2 people are fighting, and I see one person step back, take a fighting stance, and clench their fists. At that point, I can articulate there's about to be a fight, imminent, and I can step in and use force to stop that if I need to. Okay, so that would be an example of how it works. The law restricts deadly force only to protect against imminent threat of serious bodily harm or death. And that's not a significant change at all from what we're used to. That continues. Imminent, just again for the viewers' edification, is the ability, the opportunity, and the intent to commit the action, right? So there you go. It adds reasonable care standard, and this is one that's a little bit tricky. Our attorneys, the legal advisors, are still working out to flesh this out. But what we believe it means is that right now, if there isn't a crime that has been committed, is about to be committed, or will be committed, then the officer,
seeing into the future.
Yes.
Okay.
Right? The officer may have to leave that situation and remove themselves. And so, as the chief, I'm sitting here just imagining some of the complaints that come in where the perspective of a person who's called 911 will be, hey, the officers came, yeah, they talked to the person, and then they left. And I had an example of this just last week, similar. And so I want our community to understand that the officers didn't just become, lazy and don't want to do their job. They very much want to do their jobs. But if they get to this part where they realize they don't have criminal activity and there isn't imminent danger to anyone, they may have to leave that situation. And we're waiting for further specifics from our legal advisors, but that's where we think it's going to land.
Okay. So that's one of the places that we will see the department responding differently as a result, or potentially not responding as a result of these changes.
Yeah. So I have to contemplate, is there situations where we shouldn't be sending our officers? And I think it's clear, and I think everyone can understand, one of the intents of the legislation is to reduce the types of calls and the number of calls that law enforcement goes to. And I think that's a good idea, and we can get behind that. The concern for us is the back end of that is that we in Kent have really tried to be community service oriented. So if the rule forever was if you called for a Kent police officer, you got a Kent police officer. I mean, it didn't matter what. In my career, I've gone to homes to check on cats. Yes, I have done that as a police officer, because that's the level of service we want to provide. With these restrictions, I have to contemplate if we are exposing ourselves, the city, the officer, to legal liability because we put them in a situation where they can't effectively deal with the situation. So some of the calls where I see this going early on would include some of our medical aid calls, some of our suspicious subject calls, right? So neighbor call says someone's walking around in the neighborhood, they don't know who they are, can the police come check? Normally we'd respond, have a conversation. If there's nothing wrong, leave. At this point, I have to really consider whether I should send an officer. Does that create a conflict or a potential breach of the new laws by doing so?
So it changes the messaging a little bit around what we have previously said to the community around the see something, say something. If something's out of place, call us because we're happy to come and take a look. What I think I'm hearing from you is that there's going to be places now where that's not a possibility.
That's a great point. And what I would say for now, I have thought about that. Yeah. And what I would say for now is that call 911, call the non-emergency line, and let us triage what we can and can't go to. Okay. My ask with that is please be patient and please have some understanding that if we say we are not coming, and that's because it probably falls in the category of these new restrictions that we can't go.
I think that is a perfect statement and exactly why we wanted to make sure we were having these conversations with the community, because it is not a change in our desire to serve the community or be responsive to the things they call. It really is making sure that we're operating within the law as set by the Washington State Legislature.
Correct.
So let's move on to the next question. Okay. Let's talk about the impacts to service that occur as a result of this new legislation.
Right. So one of the major concerns is our ability to detain people to investigate, right? So the law allows for an officer to detain someone who they believe is involved in a crime, reasonable suspicion, right? But now, if someone runs from an officer, the only way that we know how to stop someone from running is to chase them and use force to stop them, right? Even if it's really minor force, remember what we talked about at the beginning, right. It's anything that may cause injury and any way of restraining someone's physical movement. So at this time, I don't know how to stop someone from running without using force. So we'll just say that. So now, if I don't have an arrest, if I just have suspicion that the person's involved, they run, I may not, as a police officer now, be able to chase that person. So let's give you a scenario. And for those wondering how often people run from the police, it happens every day. That's what criminals do, they run. So if I say I'm responding to your house for a burglary, and we had a call like this last week. Victim is in the house, is sleeping, wakes, and finds an intruder in her bedroom. Screams, yells, the intruder runs, thankfully, and takes off. So take that scenario, right? Intruder in the home, that's a burglary. Mm-hmm. Intruder gets out, decides to run away, officers respond, and as they're responding, the information relayed to them from dispatch is the victim describes the suspect only as a white male in his 30s. Didn't get a good look at him. Incoming officer sees a white male in his 30s in the area, a few blocks of the burglary, right? Which could have been an attempted rape, who knows, right? That person gets contacted and runs. The officer does not have grounds for an arrest. The officer may have to let that person go.
So can't require that person stay there and be questioned until additional work is being done on that.
Right. Well, there's a provision in the law called obstructing justice, and one of and our city code currently authorizes officers to arrest people who flee from them when they're told to stop and they're detained. We have been very restrictive of that, and even more so most recently in using that law, because I don't know that there's a lot of confidence in that law from the courts and the judges specifically, and our prosecutors are not trying those cases. So now we have what might be an unenforceable action in terms of obstructing justice arrests, and so now all of this combines. The thought process of the officer is, I want to comply with the law. I don't want to be liable for doing something wrong. And if you do the math on that, any reasonable officer is going to go, I think I have to let you go.
Yeah.
Which is
going to be hard then for the victim of that burglary when
Correct.
it feels like the bad guy sort of slipped through the cracks.
correct.
That's a really good example and helped me really understand sort of where we're headed with where the expectations are. But I think there's some good things in here, right? What was the legislator? What do we think the legislature's intent was behind enacting these laws?
I think there was a lot of support for removing the responsibility of law enforcement to respond to certain calls, right? If there's not a imminent threat, not having to go to, say, mental health calls, or some of our situations where the approach needs to be service, right? Providing and offering services, but not necessarily the enforcement of the law. And so I think we all have pretty strong support for that. It's the building the understanding of what else gets wrapped into that. That's going to be an ongoing conversation.
So maybe the intent absolutely positive and something we're supportive of, but the concern at this point is some of the unintended consequences of this, and then again wanting to make sure that the community really understands that this is a shift. It's a shift in the way that the police department responds in the community.
Correct.
I know you've got another example of sort of where this plays out. You want to share that with us?
Yes. So just this Monday, we had a call. Business owner called and said that a elderly female had come to her business and was expressing concerns for her safety. She said there were issues with her neighbors watching her, and then there were some unusual statements to the effect of they were using her TV to communicate with her and make threats, and so you start hearing this, and as you know, we've been well trained in crisis intervention, and initially, and I happened to take the phone call, so I dealt with this firsthand. The assessment right away is there might be some kind of emotional or mental health crisis going on. And so that falls into this, right? So the question or the assessment for my viewpoint is, does a police officer need to go? And the answer is, what it sounded like that nice woman needed was some kind of crisis response. So what I chose to do was get a hold of our commander, who then got a hold of the fire department CARES unit, the crisis response team, and they got there and they started delivering services. The business owner, who's not aware of these laws and is a very strong supporter of the community, had questions about why the police weren't responding. And I could sense that there was some frustration there. Like, I called for police and I've got a nurse here, and why is that? I need a police officer here. So we had a conversation on the phone, and I explained to her that this is the change. We used to respond to everything, and now we are going to have to back ourselves out of some of these calls. Now the gal did get some referrals to treatment.
Okay.
I do not know what the final outcome of that was, but I know that we did deliver services.
So I'm going to throw a little bit off-script question at you. We are part of the Valley CoResponder pilot program now. How does that play into this? If you had a situation like that, we've got a mental health professional with an officer. Is the officer still allowed to respond with that, or would it be a matter of having to still kind of go through those steps to get a mental health provider out there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll start by saying that the more that program comes online it gets fully staffed, the better it will help mitigate these problems. So we have a CoResponder model, which means that in the circumstances where there is reason to fear that there might be safety concerns, an imminent threat, or let's say we're contacting someone who has a history of being violent, right? We have the opportunity from when that call comes in and is dispatched for officers and mental health professionals to respond together. So there's a safety element. That said, for a lot of the calls that come in, they will be triaged, and if the determination is that there isn't a threat of safety, no imminent harm, or no history of that, then the mental health professionals will respond on their own. A lot of situations, and I think where we start to get to more of a preventative part of this, is that the officers, as they encounter people on hours when the crisis response team is not on working, or if they encounter some of our community members where they're an ongoing, you can tell over time they're starting to slip, they need resources, the crisis is coming but it's not quite there, the officers will have the ability to write up referrals to which the crisis response team will respond to after the fact, get them connected with their caseworkers, get them connected with services. So the more we grow the crisis responder team, I think the less frustration, because people will see that something's being done quicker.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chief. Any additional information you'd like to provide regarding sort of what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that a lot of times when we get new laws, the first drafts of them, the first initiation of them isn't always what we end up with. So I am hopeful that there will be some additional discussion, particularly once we start seeing data come in as to how they're being effective, and then modifications are to come. So hopefully that happens. At the same time, it's important to remember these do impact us, but we're going to find a way. We will move to more of a investigative model, reactive model, and we're going to get really, really good. The good news is we're already there. Our detectives do a phenomenal job. We're going to need to bring more resources to that, and we're just going to have to develop cases the long way. But we will do that, and we will continue to do all we can to keep our community safe.
Okay. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of these conversations regarding the new laws that came out of the Washington State Legislature. Pretty significant changes, but I am also confident that we have a plan and, again, have some of these things already in place. The goal will continue to be to keep our community safe, all of our community, and we will work through this. So know that there's going to be additional opportunities. We'll be back probably with more of these videos, but we're also going to work on some in-person conversations. So if you've got questions regarding these changes and what those impacts look like, or if you're in a situation and you're wondering, is that how we should have responded? Is there a reason why things were done that way? Want to make sure that you have the answers to those things. So Chief, thank you for the thoughtfulness that you're putting into these changes and the way that they're being implemented in our community, and for always making public safety a priority.
My pleasure. Thank you.